Saints, and I hope that you are doing well. I also pray that you've been enjoying what has been a fabulous year thus far of Bible reading. If you're watching this video, perhaps that means you've been reading along with us, or at the very least, you've been watching these videos, and so this one will be the summary for the reading that we did in the month of September. Now, September is a fabulous month, and we had a lot of fabulous reading this month. And so I'll talk about a couple of highlights that have come up over this last month, and hopefully that'll help you as you review this reading too. So we started off at the beginning of September at Ezekiel chapter 9. And so we read the bulk of the book of Ezekiel. Just to put it back in context, Ezekiel is a prophet who spent his entire time amongst and prophesying with the people of Israel in exile. And he's known for having these crazy, amazing visions and dreams and doing lots of physical prophecy, which is fairly interesting and awesome as well. A couple things I'll point out in Ezekiel chapter 11, we have this mention of a heart of flesh. You know, this whole idea that we're called to have hearts of flesh and not hearts of stone is something that I think about all the time, so I think that that's really, really nice. Fast forward to Ezekiel 14, and it talks about how things are so bad that even if Noah or Daniel or Joel were there, it still wouldn't make a difference. Darn, that's bad. And it's also interesting because oftentimes people think of Ezekiel being before Daniel because the book is before Daniel, but Ezekiel already knows about Daniel. So interesting thing about the way things are ordered. In chapter 23, we have this allegory of Aholah and Oholiba that are respectively Israel and Judah, and some really interesting and kind of juicy and gory details there. Do not read this one to your kids. Ezekiel chapter 26, we're reminded that God really doesn't like it when people say aha over the people of Judah when they're getting their just desserts. Fast forward to chapter 36, we have this passage that is read oftentimes during the Easter Vigil, where we have sprinkling clean water over the people and revival and bringing people back. And Ezekiel chapter 43, we have the glory of God returning to the temple. I skipped it, but we all know in 39 we have the Valley of the Dry Bones. That's all to say that Ezekiel is a really, really, really cool book. A lot of times people talk about Isaiah and Jeremiah, but I think Ezekiel deserves his due. Next up, we have the book of Daniel, which is my favorite of the Bible. The first chunk of it, the first 8 chapters or so, are the narrative portions where we hear about Daniel and his friends, young men who were part of the nobility who were taken in exile. And we hear about the whole Daniel plan where instead of defiling himself with the temple rations, he wanted to eat just water and vegetables to not defile himself before his God. He and his friends did it, and they came out stronger, and as the scripture says, fatter and healthier than the other young men. And then it goes on to talk about how they really did well and exceeded the success of other people by staying true to who they were and true to their God. And so we have the story of Daniel and the lion's den. We have the story of them being thrown into the furnace. It's great. And then we transition to the second part of Daniel, which is a mini version of Revelation. It has visions of what is to come. And in Daniel chapter 9, there's this really passionate prayer for the people and a response around the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the judgment to come. And so it's a really, really neat book. In the first half of Daniel, we saw stories we knew. In the second half, we see some dreams and visions that are pretty cool. One thing that I find touching is, Daniel was a very young man when he went to live in Babylon. And as a much older man, he got to see his own people returning home and got to see that hopefully. It makes me think of, so many people who've waited for so long for something to happen and then they finally see it. After this, we go into our minor prophets, and I say they're minor only in terms of the length of their books, not in their importance. We have the book of Joel, which is one of my favorite, also one of Roland's favorites. And what I love is in Joel chapter 2, it talks about how God is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. I like that, especially when I'm kind of mailing it in, and knowing that God is slow to anger is good for me. In addition, we have the book of Jonah, which is hilarious. I mean, Jonah is literally the most successful prophet in all the scriptures, the only one that got 100% of the people to come on board, and he's mad about it because these were the wrong people. But in Jonah chapter 2, he has his prayer for deliverance from within the belly of the fish, and it's actually kind of a nice prayer, so I don't give him enough credit. There's the book of Habakkuk, which asks that question, why do the wicked prosper? and also deals with God's promises of justice. And then the book of Haggai that I think about all the time, and it talks about, build the temple and then you will prosper. This whole idea that, if we tend to God's portion first, then everything else would work out. As the story went, people were being negligent about rebuilding the temple and rebuilding their houses, and it wasn't going so well for them. And so that's something that I definitely remember as I think about how I use my resources. And then finally, towards the end of September, we finished the book. We read the entire book of Zechariah, which is a really, really good book. A lot of Zechariah is actually quoted in the New Testament. For example, in Zechariah chapter 13, we hear about the pierced one, which is later on related to Jesus, which is interesting. And also in chapter 13, we get a picture of the end times as well. And earlier on in chapter 7, we hear about what a true fast is, and that is a fast of justice. And so there we have it. It was a September full of awesome Bible reading. I hope that you enjoyed every minute of it. And as we go through the month of October, we'll be diving into the New Testament. And so if you haven't started that yet, you can start it now and join the New Testament challenge. That'll take us through the end of the year. But otherwise, be well, and I'll see you soon.